Hello, everyone. We're still a couple of minutes early, but I think we can start because most people are here. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you a brief introduction. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. We're here for a special event for our PowerWeb Lunch Lecture series. I am Francesco Lombardi. I'm assistant professor here at TU Delft, and it's my pleasure to be here to host and moderate this session. Before jumping into today's topic and speakers, just a brief introduction about PowerWeb for those of you who might be joining us for the first time and wondering what is PowerWeb. PowerWeb is an institute, it's a cross-faculty institute at TU Delft, which means it is a place where we can do more than what we can do in our individual faculties, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, technology policy and management, and so on. We can do great things there about the energy transition, but for big challenges, we need to come together. That's what we do at PowerWeb. We come together to try and support the design of intelligent, integrated, and inclusive energy systems. And of course, when we want to achieve this goal, expanding our capabilities in terms of grid infrastructure is one of the most prominent challenges, and this is what we're going to discuss today. In fact, recently a report has been commissioned by the Dutch government called Schakelen naar de toekomst, or Switching to the Future, which discusses ways to make the expansion of the grid and the deployment of the future energy systems affordable for everyone, which is a big challenge. So to talk about this, today we have four prominent experts of the topic. First of all, we have Elisabeth Slagboom, Senior Policy Officer at the Ministry of Finance. Then we have Manon Janssen, Inspector of the Budget at the Ministry of Finance, and one of the 5 authors of this report that I've just mentioned. Then we have David Stolker, Manager External Reporting at Steding, and also from Steding, System Strategist Arjan van Voorden, but also TU Delft Research Fellow. So we have the best panel that we can imagine. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our very welcome speakers. Please entertain us and educate us with your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you too. Okay, before we will start with go one further. Yes, I will give a brief introduction about spending reviews, and then we go into the different topics which we have included in our research. First of all, a spending review, it's a term used also in the EU, and it's an instrument that allows national authorities to improve public spending. We do there a couple a year. Last year, for instance, we've done some about health distribution, or wealth distribution, education quality, and also elderly care. A spending review is remarked that it is independent, even though it is a mission by the government. It is an independent research that is done. And we do that with several ministries together, but also the Bureau of Economy Policy Analysis is included. And for this specific interministerial spending review, we also included regulators and system operators as well to support us in our research. We initiated this review because we wanted to gain more insight and grip into the energy structure and the investment made, because we saw that the investments were increasing a lot. And then the companies such as State and Antenna, they came to the government asking for more funding. And we wanted to be more sure, like, why are they asking this funding, what is needed, and to get a broader understanding of the topic. And ultimately, of course, the government is also responsible for the entire system. However, you see that responsibilities are not always at the government. We have an independent regulator who oversees the system operators, which is outside of the government. And the system operators are also, of course, by themselves responsible. They are, however, in public hands, but they're private companies. With regards to the energy system, we see a threefold challenge, or a trilemma, to meet 3 different goals, which can compete at some times. Because we want to keep the energy bill affordable for everyone, and that sometimes conflict with how to keep it sustainable as another goal, and also to reduce dependency. So a term that's used now a lot because of also the geopolitical tensions is strategical autonomy, and what we need to do to achieve that. To address these three goals and these topics, we first needed to know what will the entire cost will be, what will the investment be up to 2040. That's where David will talk a little bit more about and dive into the expenses and the investments expected. Then we looked into what if we know what the cost will be, how can we mitigate them? So what technical things we can do to the system to perhaps have lower cost or make different choices, get more flexibility. Arjan will talk about that more. And then Manon will take the other two topics on how we can share costs differently. Because in the end, there is always a bill to pay. How are we going to pay those bills and divide it among everyone? And three, also what can government do to improve decision making? And we'll end with what lies ahead and cabinet's response. David.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So now I'll briefly discuss the financial projections part. As Elisabeth already pointed out, there are a couple of goals that we would like to achieve with an energy system. It needs to be reliable, it needs to be sustainable, but it also needs to be affordable. And affordability has become an ever bigger issue over the last couple of years. So first of all, our industry, which needs to compete at an international level, but also households who sometimes struggle to pay their energy bills. So before Arjan will talk about some of the interventions that could be considered to reduce the total cost, it is important to establish a baseline. So based on current investment plans of the Dutch grid operators, what is the expected investment in the electricity grid? Last year in the summer 2024, we conducted this study, which was actually a bit broader than just electricity, but it included different energy carriers, also gas, hydrogen, and certain heating systems. But the focus today is really on the electricity part. So what you can see here is basically an overview of, first of all, the investments into the electricity grid in the last couple of years. And then from 2024 onwards, of course, it's 2025 by now, but when we conducted the study, it was 1 year ago. We looked at the period from 2024 up until and including 2040. And for electricity, that sum adds up to almost 200 billion euros. So this includes TenneT as the TSO, but also the three largest DSOs in the Netherlands, which are Alliander, Stedin, and Enexis. What is important to realize here is that, of course, this is an estimate. Every 1 or 2 years when we do a new study based on the latest insights, new scenarios, new policy choices that have been made, etc., you see that every time that revision results in different outcomes. So that's also why we said, well, there is a range. This is not an exact number, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty to come up with an exact figure. But whether it's 200 billion, 190 billion, or 210 billion, I don't know the exact answer, but I think the key message is that it will require significant investments in the coming years. Also, all of these amounts here are in real terms, and that means that they exclude inflation. So this is just based on price levels as they were in 2024, but of course there will also be annual inflation. So that's something that's also important to take into account. And then the next question is how do these investments translate into grid fees, which in the end need to be paid by all parties that are connected to the grid. There's of course different types of users, which are at the bottom of the slide. Unfortunately, I was not able to change the language, so it's still in Dutch. Apologies for that. I don't think that's the key thing for this slide. But what is the graph actually shows is the annual growth of grid fees for different groups of users, again, in real terms, so excluding inflation. And what you see is that the annual rate is somewhere between 5% and 7%. Well, if you think about your own savings account, there's also a kind of interest on interest effect, compounded interest. The same applies here. So if you add the 5 to 7% per year over over the full period up until 2040, you see that grid fees are expected to rise from with 200 to 300% in just 15 years time, and again that excludes inflation. So it actually will become more expensive to pay our electricity grid. This is all based on what estimates made by grid operators at the beginning of 2024. Those are based on scenarios. Those scenarios include a lot of assumptions, and they are revised every 1 to 2 years. But by doing this study, we established a baseline, and that also helps to think about the impact of system interventions. So how can we reduce those total costs? Also, one key thing that I will highlight before handing over to Arjan is that investments are not the same as costs in the year that they are incurred. Of course, investments last for a longer period. So if we do big investments in this year, it doesn't mean that they all are included in the total grid cost and therefore in the tariffs in the current period, but you depreciate them over a very long period up until 50 or sometimes even 60 years. So on an annual basis, grid operators determine what their annual grid costs are, which include operating expenditures, depreciation, and cost of capital. And if you combine those three figures, then you get grid tariffs. Having this baseline, it's time to hand over to you, Arjan.
So thank you, David, to present the baseline. And let us switch back to the baseline and see that the numbers on the slide here. So onshore is more than 100 billions. And there is also an offshore part. And so in my talk, I will only talk about the 100 millions of the onshore part. There's also an offshore part, but it's not taken as part of my presentation. So also what David says, that in the baseline itself, it's already some measures are included. So 20% of the houses are connected in the baseline to the heat networks. That's already baseline. If it does not reach that level of 20%, then the baseline will go up. So if we will influence this baseline, we will do, especially for heat networks, more than 20% of the houses connected to the heat. But that's not only a measure that we can take. So we did a big brainstorm session together with IBO and also with the Boston Consultancy Group together, and we figured out a lot of measures. And here you see some parts which are reaching the end. So we can for sure do something with flexibility by the end customers. Behind the meter or before the meter, we can do something with small customers and by large customers. Energy saving is also a very important part, because the energy you do not use, you do not have to transport. So district heating I talked about a little bit, and also spatial energy planning. That means that you bring the supply and demand imbalance on the local level, and not producing the energy at, let's say, Groningen and consume it at Zuid-Holland. And the last part is also very important. Can we use our actual network better? And what our benefits are there? So you see here all the points you taken, and it's good to mention that it's not only cost, it's also a changing of the system, because we are going to another system which is other operated than fired by fossil, and now we are fired by wind and solar. And to achieve the sustainable goals, we have to make another system. And that is also a nice, and I'm very happy that Ibo said, schakelen naar de toekomst, switching to the future, is also not only cost-driven, it's also you have to switch to the other system. So on the right side, you see some groups of measurements controlling demand and supply, but end users, the small users, the big users. And when let's see the figures, what can we do in all those 5 clusters? And when you see here the baseline, and you see here the voltage levels, and this refers to the colors. A lot of investments goes to the medium voltage levels. You see here, 45 billion euros to expand our medium voltage level. And with all the measures, you can reduce that. In the maximum, when you take all the investments, all the incentives, we can reduce to 30% of the investment. And that's a lot. So 30% of 100 billion is a lot of money. So it's split up. You see here what we can see here, what you can reach, but it's not all for free. If you go to the limits of your network, it gives you another system. Let's say for the flexibility and the end customers, we will use in the maximum scenario capping the PV output at a certain time. So also reducing the charge power of your charge pole. At a certain time, we will switch off or at least reduce the power to keep the network stable. Also, in a certain period, let's say a very cold period, we have to influence the heat pumps, and it leads to less comfortable houses. Probably we can do something about that, but in insulation, but the Tory should be told fair that if you will reach the 30%, this influence, the things are in influence. Also, the commitment of the house batteries cannot be in a lot of freedom. When we look to the spatial energy planning, you bring together the energy supply and demand, and is not the freedom for you can place where you are. Then you can make incentives for the local demand and local supply, but also for flexible assets are placed on a certain place in the network to help also the network. And the last part is the higher loading of the network, utilization increasing can lead to damage. You have to be very sure. You only go to the limit, it can lead to damage. And we reduce the redundancy of the network, it can lead to outages. And last week I've seen in Spain what's the effect of an outage. Probably not so long as here, but the fair storytelling is well that it could be the impact. And if you do not want this impact, you have to pay the bill. So it's so clear. I think that is my part. Then I can hand over to Manon.
I'll just take this then. So now that we've seen what the baseline is and that you could defer from there by 28% with measures that, as Arjan stated, could be very impactful on certain households. Like it's nothing to not be able to heat your house at the times you want to heat it, or the risk of outages is not something to take lightly. Those are risks you need to consider. But then also we want to know you also can see like the other side of that is that you have to spend less. And that brings us to affordability. And I want to talk about share the cost differently, because if you still have left those 80 odd billion on land and still the 88 on sea, that means there's still a lot of cost to be divided, and someone is gonna have to pay them. There's certain ways to do the division of that cost differently than we do it now. Like I think David already started on it. Like what we do now is we look at those investments, spread them over time, and then we add them to this is a grid tariff for this year, and that's what consumers are going to pay. But there's different ways to do that. For example, subsidizing. If you subsidize the investment, then it does not have to end up in a grid tariff. Sounds idyllic, but the other side of that is taxpayers are going to pay for that subsidy scheme. So there's still a bill to be paid. There is no free lunch here. I'm going into a few of these, and first I wanted to remind you, we haven't seen this slide yet, but I think it's insightful to see what changes for the different groups of end users. So if we stick to the way we divide the costs now, you will see that households will go from about 641 grid tariffs a year now to, well, much more. And you see that relatively that's a lot more than, for example, industrial companies or well, the very large companies. There's a few more groups of end users, but I wanted to show you this to see like what part of the bill is going to be grid tariffs, and that means that the composition of your bill is going to be different. And also the taxes part. Think about those taxpayers as you see this. So there's 3 ways you can think of dividing the bill. Generally, the first one is, well, you don't even want to end up on the doorstep of consumers. You just want to, take that away before it even arrives. The second one is, okay, we know this is what it's going to cost, and we want to compensate that somehow. So everyone still gets the bill, but they'll get something out of it elsewhere. So on the whole, it's not that painful. And the last one is, well, can we share costs internationally as not to end up on Dutch doormats, but somewhere else? The first one, I already talked a little about it, is subsidizing the investments. Roughly, you can think of 1 billion of government subsidies a year to a grid operator to mean about 50 euros on a household bill. So 1 billion for 50 euros can be quite substantial, which would mean if you want to dampen the effect to 2030, you would need, in the year 2030, you would need about 4 billion government subsidies to not get the rising line that David showed you. That would have to be paid by taxpayers. So it's still getting paid only not by end users, but by everyone just in a different way. You can also look at making like feed-in tariffs. So not only end users, but also part of the producers actually paying for using the network, which the regulator is also researching because it would fit into the cost reflectivity principle. So if you use the grid, you pay accordingly, which producers also use the grid. So that's the thought there. The other one is tariff differentiation, because we also see that our current grid is sort of built on peak moments. So if you can do peak shaving and use a little less between 4 and 7, when everyone gets home, starts cooking, turns off the lights, starts doing the washing, and turns on the dishwasher, etc., etc. If we can spread that out with certain incentives, then maybe we would not need to enhance the grid as much as we're planning. So that's the incentive there is tariff differentiation. So it's a price stimulus. The second one is targeted compensation. So we'll know this is the grid, and users are going to pay what they're going to pay, but we don't want that for certain groups. For example, low-income households. If you followed the news last week, you saw that there was an energy fund for low-income households, which was empty within the week. That is a form of compensation. Another one is, for example, compensating industry because they have a disadvantage next to neighboring countries, for example. That's also a compensation you can do as government. The last one is sharing costs internationally. Well, we use the word transactional, which is not that popular, but you could be a little different in, for example, Denmark, who made a wind park offshore, and then there's like, well, we know most of this is going to be for Germany. Germany, let's talk. So if we know we're a large exporter of renewables, and that seems to be the trend more and more, maybe you could start having discussions with neighboring countries about, okay, what do we use, what do you use, and can we get to a share of costs somehow? There's also, I should mention, a cost analysis in the European Union. There's working on guidelines on how can we cost share big projects that are international instead of sort of bilateral bilateral contracts that there are now, just maybe to institutionalize that a little bit more, so it's more easy to talk to neighboring countries about who uses what and how are we going to share that. These are a few of the options. I already explained a few of those. So we have subsidized system, subsidize the system operator, public energy fund, I mentioned the industrial compensation. You can also do a tax reduction. I didn't go into that one, but that's also a way to, if you get the expenditure book of a household, and less taxes also, makes it easier to pay the bills on the other side. Internationally, so cost sharing mechanisms and EU funding is one I didn't mention. We see that, maybe you read the Draghi report about the economic position of Europe compared to the United States and China, and they were also talking about a lot about energy costs and that putting pressure on the economic system here, and thinking about making funds to enhance this. And last, the feed-in tariffs, the tariff differentiations, and the modifying of the financing system. I should mention, we didn't mention it yet, but a lot of this is also in the hands of the regulator. So we ideally, or not ideally, but you could say, government is elected, so why should they not be able to say, well, this is the price and I don't want my citizens to pay more than this? We haven't chosen to do that. It's been in the hands of the regulator for a long time, because you want, stable, and for a long time it was a stable system with not too many shocks or changes. So this is not in hand of government to just change tariffs. We can only, what I just mentioned, subsidize, do something about the taxes, and maybe compensate, but you can't say, well, I just want that grid tariff to be lower than it is. This is a special, I will mention later if anyone has questions. And then I wanted to go into the decision making also, because Elisabeth also already started with it in the start of the presentation, but politicians are somehow surprised when they get the bill as well. Just like in a household, you're like, oh, this much? Well, the same goes for government, because but government is not, can't sort of make the tariffs. They can't say, well, everyone's going to pay this much, so they're also not that involved. It's not on the budget. So the moment the government gets say, it's usually when it's on the budget, especially for Parliament, because they can say, no, I don't want this because this is too much and I have budget right. Well, this is off budget because it goes through the system operators. The only part that's on budget is the loan for TenneT as a state-owned enterprise. And state-owned enterprises get loans from, well, in this case, the Ministry of Finance. So at some point, the Minister of Finance has to say, well, TenneT has to spend a lot more because of all the renewable goals you made in 2020. And that means that the new scenario is what it is. And that means there needs to be, well, in one of the cases, it was 25 billion from the Ministry of Finance as a loan, because we need to pay for this somehow. And we need to attract private investments as well. And Parliament was surprised by 25 billion. And 25 billion is not something you want to be surprised by. So there were a lot of questions to the Minister of Finance. Like, how did this happen? What did you do? What decisions did we miss? Did you send us a letter about this? What's happening here? And then the Minister of Finance has to go to Parliament and be like, yeah, well, guys, that was not my plan. I mean, I didn't do anything differently in the last few months. This is just, we together decided these are the new goals. We want renewable energy. We want to reach certain goals, and that means the grid has to accommodate that. That means these extensions are necessary. That means this is what TenneT needs to actually do that. And that was one of the reasons that we started this research, because that didn't really go over that well, and it just caused a lot of questions and a really awkward position for the coalition. And that was added to the fact that industries were knocking on the door when the prices are too high. We really can't compete. Please help us. So those two things made that we started this research. And one of the questions was also, how can we do this differently in The Hague, actually? Like, why are we so surprised? How can we get a little more grip on this? What's happening here? So can we get some insight in this? This was the last part of our research. And the access to information is one of the things we started with, because they get a lot of different documents, but it's all very fragmented. So at some point you see like, okay, we want to do this much on renewables. And on the other hand, okay, we have nuclear goals. okay, on the other hand, we have heating goals, and then it all has to come together. But at the time, you don't really know what the infrastructure infrastructure need is, and especially not what the price is, because the only people who can actually work on that and actually plan what needs to be done and then estimate how much it's going to cost is the grid operators, and they're not part of government. So this sort of happens separately, which is not ideal and leads to outcomes of being surprised by 25 billion. So one of the things, well, we need access to this information, investment outlooks for Parliament, as well as expected grid tariffs and financing needs. So what do the different grid operators need to actually do this? And inside in, because we mentioned in the baseline, there's about 20% of households have to be connected to heating systems, but we don't always know what's in the scenarios. We don't talk that much with the grid operator. So that was one of the things we really started with and was really useful to actually learn what's in your scenarios when you start to do all the estimates. And do they align with policy options? And that's not always the case. So can we have a conversation about this is what we think is realistic? This is what, for example, the Central Planning Bureau thinks is realistic. This is the prices we expect, and then work from that. So with agreement on the parameters before we start doing the math. And one of the things also, which is I think a nice find, and also everyone involved was really happy to work with that, is a grid impact assessment. So if we have big plans for policy, then before we decide on the policy, just get an assessment from the grid operators. But okay, if we do this, then what would that mean for the grid, and what would that mean for the cost? And then eventually you can say, well, that would mean a plus or minus on the grid tariff as well. And the last part is a little bureaucratic maybe, but you could also say we want to have connected the policy and the budget cycles better, because now you decide on policy somewhere in the year where you can decide on budget, because we have 2 moments in the year where you can decide on different budgets. So you can't actually, in October, for example, you can't say, well, we're going to spend 100 million on this, because October is not a moment when you talk about budgets. That's only in the spring or in August. So you want to bring those two together, because now there's a constant disconnect between, hey, we want to spend money on this, and hey, we want to have higher renewable goals, for example, and we want to align those two to make sure you know the same things at the same time, and you can decide as a package, we want to increase this, and this. The costs are this, and that's fine, but that also would have an effect on a certain group that we don't like, so we're going to compensate them. So you have the whole package at once. You decide on that, and then you can start your monitoring. This is have the effect we intended. But at least you had all the information at the time, and now it's much, much more fragmented. These are 8 recommendations that I'm going to skip, so I'm giving it back to Elisabeth.
Okay, we'll keep it short so you also have time to ask some questions. With this report, same as other research, we also recommend more research is necessary. We're in a transition, it requires everyone, and we need to cooperate all together, and also, as Manon stated, talk together and really change the mindset and the way we're looking at the system. It's much more a flexible system. It's not the system we had. We're going towards a new system, and that just requires more cooperation along the way with system operators, regulators, but also in the government as well. The cabinet also is required to give a response on spending reviews, which was actually last Friday, together with a package from the Ministry of Climate and Green Growth, where a lot of measures were announced. However, it's still at the really beginning phase, so they're gonna explore more and see how they can actually reduce about 10 to 20 billion in investments expenses. However, they have not finalized or elaborate really good on how they're going to do that. But things they are going to do is, for instance, there's more money for an insulation fund. So households can insulate their houses, so they reduce their energy. As well as try to standardize smart systems for heat pumps, for instance, so they actually can be switched off between 4 and 7 when the peak is really high. Also, with regards to share costs differently, they taken some measures. It's, for instance, the 600 million for energy bill reduction. It's energy tax reduction. But Manon also said, like, if you put 1 billion in it, you only get 50 euros discount. With energy taxes, this is 200 million each year. So it will deduct the energy bill with 20 euros. So not so much. And it will also continue for industrial companies, the IKC ETS. So they also get a deduction on their energy bills. And furthermore, Cabinet also said they're going to adapt all the recommendations that were on the slides in the decision-making process. But how that's exactly going to look like, they're not sure yet. But they've given it a good go. I think we're going to give some room for questions and discussions, given the time.
Okay, thanks a lot for the super insightful presentation. I'm sure there's plenty of questions. So we're gonna use a fancy fly microphone, which I just need to activate here. That's good. Let's test it. Okay. Normally we have until 1:30, but today we have 15 minutes extra. I know some of you might need to go anyway after 1:30, but for those of you who can, I want to say we have 15 extra minutes. So if you want to perhaps come over here, we can open the floor to the questions. Is there... Oh, difficult one.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks first and foremost for a very nice presentation. My question was about one comment that was on one of the last slides. Doing nothing is not an option. And so my question is, did you do some kind of calculation to compare what costs would incur if we would do nothing, kind of? Because we also hear, or business as usual case, because we also hear that investing now is cheaper than investing in 50 years when we kind of figured out that it's too late. So that's yeah, that's my question to all of you, I guess.
Thank you. Good question. We did not ourselves did investigation about that, but there are other researchers which investigated. If you do nothing, it will cost about 40 billion every year in economic value that you do not get. So the faster you increase the grid and you get more people connected, your economic value will go up, and that will get you more in general than if you do nothing. And if you do nothing, the cost will only increase. So about 30 to 40 billion each year. Yes, because you get more people to the grid. Yeah, it's an investment in the future. However, that sometimes is difficult to put into numbers because economic value is something else than actually investment costs and expenses.
And maybe one thing to add also on the investments, I think it's also important to take into account that not all of the investments are to expand the electricity grid, but there's also part of it is just replacing the electricity grid. Of course, after the kind of lifetime of assets, you need to replace them by new ones. So the 200 billion is not just to, or not only to expand the grid, but also basically to keep what we already have.
I like the positive framing here. The operational cost is about a quarter of the whole part. So that means 3/4 is investment. So that's still pretty good. And that would mean about, well, roughly, don't quote me here, but about 10 billion a year with, well, economic worth between, well, 25 and 40 million that you get by more people on the grid, because there's more capacity to, get everyone on there. And also the economic worth by more companies actually producing and bringing wealth. So I really like the positive message. Yes, it's better to just do something, because if it's a simple sum, if you take it like if you make it like that.
Yeah, thanks. So in the newspaper, we read that the economic damage of the current waiting line is like 10 to 30 billion a year or something. So the first question, isn't it then much more logical to focus on connecting all those parties instead of looking at the cost reductions of, let's say, a few billion, which is 30 billion is the total sum over the whole period. So why is not the value of connecting more parties that are currently on the waiting line in the analysis? And the second question is it desirable to look this much at flexibility? For instance, the heat pump flexibility, I think, gives 4 billion in total savings over the period of 15 years. That's, let's say, 200 million euros a year. We just said that's 10 euros a household per year. If your numbers of a billion a year are 50 euros a household, so then 200 billion is 10 euros a household. Why would I want my heat pump flexible, my car flexible, and everything adjusted for 10 euros a year, a euro per month on my energy bill, basically?
Yeah, well, a couple of questions. So probably Arjan, you also need to answer. But if you think about it, already at this moment, people struggle to pay their energy bills. So maybe for you and for me, it's not a problem to pay 10 euros extra, but for some people it is. Also for industry, they're already facing huge difficulties. Already the current energy bills are a problem. At least that's how they are perceived. And also, I think many of the interventions, but Arjan can probably explain better, don't focus only on reducing the cost, but if you utilize your grid more efficiently, that also helps to get more people connected to the grid and therefore reduce the waiting lines that are currently in place. But also those waiting lines are not just a result of economic decisions, but also it's also a matter of scarcity. It's very difficult to get enough skilled workers to do all the work. Permitting is a big issue. And also we compete at a global market to get all the materials that we need. So getting everybody connected is a key thing that there's very, very much focus on. But at some point, there's also the cost aspect that comes into play and needs to be considered. So the focus here was mainly on affordability and the cost, but I think many of the measures also have a positive effect on getting more people connected to the grid sooner. Maybe Arjan, something to...
Yeah, the scenarios that we are the baselines that we connect all the people that we want to connect. So, but actually we have how we call it in Dutch, a maakbaarheidsgat. So we cannot do what we want to do, not only from cost, but it's also for the technical people, the materials we do not have, the space we do not have. So there's a lot of reasons that we cannot connect actually what we want, and there is an economic potential of 40 billion a year to connect more people, but we cannot connect it at the moment.
So the big question is, why are we looking at small numbers while we could look at...
No, actually, the first 8 years, if you do all the measures to get more flexibility or sweating the asset and those kind of things, the first 8 years, you won't reduce any cost. You just get more grid connections. And after those 8 years, then you start actually decreasing the cost. But because we have the maakbaarheidsgat, which we have not enough staff to actually do it, these are all, I would say, like no regrets, because you get more people connected to the grid. So that's the main focus for the first 8 years. So we cannot reduce any costs in the first 8 years, is what this research said. So we did include those things as well. And the other benefit is, of course, it will decrease the bill.
Thank you. There was a question over there. Yeah.
Okay, so coming back to the original question of who's going to pay for all of this, then it seems that if we see, for example, the breakdown that you did on the tariffs and taxes and whatnot, and the compensation, having that as a first priority, and then we combine that with, for example, the plans that Tenet, Alliander, and Stedin have, and in the particular case of Stedin, which has most of the regions of the Randstad, they're not doing more flexibility. They're actually breaking the mesh, or at least that's what the previous public plans that they had shown in their latest declarations last year. So they're going for a more radial mesh with less intelligence in it, or putting more focus on putting more cables. And the households are going to have a higher tax. Small business is going to have a higher tax and tariffs. So for one hand, we say that we want more flexibility, but then a big part of DSOs don't have a great focus on flexibility, or apparently that's what they had until last year. I don't know, I might be mistaken on that. And then also small businesses and households have to pay more. So it seems that the big part of the money is going to come from the users like us. So am I like wrong on interpreting that, or how's that going?
I'm going to give this one to Arjan. What we recommended in this Evo is that we also are asking the system operators such as Stedin to not only take investments into their plans, but also what they're doing about flexibility or how much redundancy they have on the net. So.
And one small thing, if they turn off our smart and flexible assets, in none of these presentation is the part where we actually get paid for supplying this flexibility as users.
So really Dutch questions. You are already integrated in the Dutch society. Speaking about what are the things for me? That's great, Dario. Because we have a very reliable and sustainable network now, and when we have a lot of focus on flexibility, and there's a lot of people, I think more than 100 people in the Stedin focusing on finding flexibility, but none of the less of the people, and Diederik can also tell about that, are when they have connection, they are not to give the flexibility, because I have my connections, so there is a big difference between the haves and the have-nots. When I have a connection, I have capacity, I'm not allowed to share the capacity with others, and there are others on the waiting list. We're asking to the guys from, you have the capacity, can you give something to me at a certain time? I'm not doing that. And I will pay for that. How much? It should be increased more. And then I will, but I think that's not a very social system.
Thank you for the presentation. On one of the slides, you show that the flexibility is about 4 billion of all the costs that it can reduce. And I'm quite surprised by that number because it's relatively small. And when I take a step back and I look at why are we actually investing in the grid, that's because we have a lot of solar panels, we are connecting our cars to the grid, heat pumps. So I guess the grid needs to get stronger. Then I would expect that if I'm making these assets flexible, the heat pumps, adding batteries, doing something smart with the solar panels, I would expect this flexibility part to be way bigger than just these 4 billion that are mentioned there.
When you say 4 billion, but it's 400,000 million euros. So there's quite a lot of money there. So it's presented as 4. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you also have the knock-on effects you see here. That means that the flexibility in the low voltage networks has influence on the medium voltage, and that means by knock-on effects. So you see that when you more balance the low voltage network, it has positive effects on the medium voltage and also on the high voltage, and that is mentioned as 7 and 6 billion.
100 and
almost 100. Huh?
Let's. If we take how would I say it?
You expect more than 4?
Yeah, I would still expect
Yeah,
more than
yeah,
4
yeah.
because if all the reason why we're investing in the grid is because we need to do the investments in the grid to let's say replace the old parts. Sure, that was I think the 3 or 4 billion a year, and the rest, the 10, is about making the grid stronger. But due to assets like cars, panels, heat pumps. And then on the other hand, you're saying that if I make those flexible, it's even if I add up 4, 7, 6, I'm not there. I'm not at the 20. So I'm not understanding.
Yeah, well, I don't have all the answers on the flexibility thing, but I do think it's also important to kind of keep the overall, and that was not part of the research that was done, but it was kind of taken as I think a starting point is the climate ambitions that we set. So that resulted in the energy transition, not just climate, but also security of supply, etc. But I think it's also important to take into account that an electricity grid costs a lot more than a gas grid. So by changing the energy mix and electrifying, we will inherently have higher costs at some point. And it's more difficult to keep that system or that grid balanced. And of course, you can always invest more, but at some point there is also, I think, there's limits to what you can actually build in terms of the electricity grid. So it's not just about the cost and what you can save by making it more flexible, but it's also about making it possible at all to expand the grid, considering all the constraints that there are in terms of space, etc. So I think that, again, there's multiple benefits to many of the measures that are being proposed.
And there is a background report available from BCG with a lot of slides. So if you want to dive deep in that, we will share with PowerWeb all the slides. It's open source. We'll send it to Francesco, and then you can find it on the website. And if you have questions, on Fridays, I'm always on the 3rd floor of the Laagbouw.
Okay, there's a question already next to the same person.
Right, so I have a question about alternative forms of energy transport, because now we know we're not going to be 100% electrified in 20 years, right? So so let's say you use existing gas infrastructure or even added infrastructure to transport blue or green hydrogen. This question was going to come, right? Hydrogen. But I get that it's super inefficient. But transport, it's a hollow tube versus a massive cable. So material-wise, it's a lot more interesting, and there's already a lot of those infrastructure out there. So how does the increase in grid tariffs compare to the decrease in capex investments and the increase in opex for the end customers?
We actually did not dive into the energy or what energy we use. So we really focused on electricity. We did investigate, like, if we change the energy mix into more nuclear or more hydrogen, or what would that do? But in the end, those grids also cost a lot. And we did not see a positive or a negative effect that it would change the entire bill if you look at the electricity system in total. But we decided, and as we were requested, that we keep the energy mix as it is. So we took that as a given. Do you want to add something more?
Maybe not what it is, but what the National Program Energy Infrastructure 2050 required, which was electricity as 50 to 70% of the energy mix. So we did sort of like a sensitivity check for nuclear and hydrogen. That's also in the report, and it didn't give us immediate signs like that we might be way off, and that's why we left it, because we had a certain scope cabinet gave us to work with, and this already took us 9 months, I'm afraid to say. So because we only did electricity now and could do hydro. Mhm. I can only, yeah, I can say like this is in the scope, but we also see like the production and consumer side of hydrogen is just not where we need it to be to actually be able to make a knowledge-based decision on this. So for now, maybe that might be the case, and we're heading, you need to go somewhere because standing still is not an option. So we're going this way. And if in a few years, because we also recommend like keep doing the scenarios, keep seeing where it's going. And we would not recommend to do this every year again. But this is going to keep changing, I think. This it's a choice for a different system. And we try to do like a sensitivity check, but I'm not saying this is going to be the future in 2050. We just need to go where it's somewhere, because standing still is getting us nowhere.
We would have a question over here, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the presentations. I maybe taking it on a little bit on previous question, and focusing the discussion on let's say heating, which is still 50% of the final energy use, whereas electricity is roughly 1/4. I think one interesting point was mentioned just shortly, like you said, I think district heating was 20% in your models. And I was wondering, I mean, projections are somewhere ranging between 15 and 45% now in last policy, let's say, provisions. So my question is rather, this will affect probably what you do on the heating grid, on the electricity grid quite a lot. Is there any interaction with the discussion on how to fund, let's say, that kind of infrastructure versus electricity infrastructure? Because this is all integrated in a way, and I think it would be very good to have a more holistic approach there, because it will definitely affect each other massively.
I share certainly the last part that you should have a more integrated look at this, because there's going to be an energy memorandum every year in which you look at the complete energy mix, because for now it's 20% heating is in the scenarios, and like I said, 50 to 70 for electricity, and then the rest is divided by a few other sources. To get to that 20, that seems pretty ambitious at the moment. So, there's a lot of discussions. There's a new law on heating, and the financing of that is part of it. So that's really part of the discussion there. So it is being taken into account, and that's also what we recommend on your decision-making package. Like if you suddenly have to increase your electricity goals because your heat goals are staying behind, then you should either choose to invest more in the electricity part, or do something on the electricity part, or invest more on the heating side. So I totally agree that it should be taken at the same time, not be as fragmented, and that should be, that's the policy cycle we advised on as well. Thanks. And that's taken into consideration, or no, adaptation.
Okay, we still have a couple of minutes for last couple of questions. Let's try the gentleman over there.
All right, thank you. My question is related to the recent events in Spain and Portugal, because it seems that the higher the renewable energy fraction of power into the grid, the worse resilience there are to frequency shocks. And so it seems that grid investments will also need to have a certain portion into flywheels or battery storage to restore that frequency. What do you think about that?
I think you jumped to the conclusions, and I spoke with Lily and also with Peter. I think it will be good that Peter will give a lecture in the short term about the situation in Spain and Portugal when the research is done. So because now we have a lot of suggestions about what happens in Portugal and Spain, I think we have to learn from that, and we have some ideas about what happens there. And I think it should be in the direction that you say, but let's be first focused on the research and what really happened, and then we come back and we can give a lecture together. And I will join a lecture or so from Peter to do it together. What happened, what we can learn from that, and what we should be probably more invest in our network. What can be added up to the baseline. But I think the situation of the Netherlands is much different of the Iberic island.
Thanks a lot. Any last question before we wrap it up? No? Okay. Then we can consider the Q&A session closed. Even more insightful to the presentation, I would say. Thank you everyone for joining us, and let's thank again our fantastic panel speakers. Thank you, and we will make the slides available and see you next time for our next PowerWeb Lunch Lecture. Thanks again.